I'd managed to listen to every Beatles album at least once. I was gonna.
Poor bastard.
Some of them are good, some of them are not so good. I almost watched A Hard Day's Night, but I thought it was not really going to add much to the podcast, so I'm not wasting 2 hours of my life watching a Beatles movie.
Better off watching North by Northwest if you want a train-based film to watch.
I haven't seen that.
Oh, is that the old Alfred Hitchcock film?
Yeah.
It's a beautiful film.
Yeah,
It's amazing.
I've never
Yeah,
seen
yeah.
it. No.
What a great film, man.
I've not seen that many Hitchcock films, actually. I've only seen...
North by Northwest is his best,
Rear
in
Window?
my opinion. Rear Window's good.
Window's really good, actually, as well.
But good old Jimmy Stewart, man.
Yeah, it is a good film. It feels ahead of its time, even though you can tell, like, production values it's not, but story-wise it is. Oh, Martin's got some red light.
Moonlight. Hell yeah.
That's the Baphomet light right there.
It's the Velvet Underground.
Have you got your pentagram drawn out?
Yeah, I'm doing everything I can to get him to come round, but he just doesn't. That's the white light. Whoa.
Hello. Hello, hello. You say goodbye and I say, hold on to your drawers. It's time for the Cacophony Sessions Lonely Hearts Club podcast. Tonight we take on the Fab Four. In case you were born yesterday, this podcast has travelled a long and winding road, but I am the Eggman, not Dr. Robotnik. No, my name is Dan Whitell, and I don't do this by myself. I get by with a little help from my friends. And they are Martyn.
Hello, I'm Martyn, and I don't have a one-liner.
Okay. Tom?
You realise that tin food is just for crackheads and wars? That's supposed to be a question, but I fucked it up. Sorry.
Dan B.
I'm addicted to collecting vintage Beatles albums. I need help.
It's a good one,
difficult
too.
to get.
So welcome to the show. Whether you're watching this on the free opening sample on our Cacophony Sessions YouTube channel, listening in on one of the various podcast platforms, or even if you've given 5 of your kindest pounds to provide me with a actual income and watch the full podcast in all its video glory on our Patreon, join us as we discuss our favourite Beatles albums, our favourite Beatles songs, our favourite Beatles themselves, and the best cover versions of their songs that there are out there. Hit us up on Facebook, send your tweets to @CacSessionsPod, and point your angry fingers over the YouTube comments section after you've subscribed to our channel for your takes and your opinions on our takes. Bells, whistles, plugs, likes, Baphomet, and jazz fusion. It's time to slaughter those long-haired sacred cows from Liverpool. Or perhaps not. We'll see. As a warm-up, though, it's time for the quick-fire quarry blast, uncovering the buried gems in our collective minds. It's time for Does It Slap?
Don't trade a podcast where the jingles are crap. So let's take a good song and ask, does it slap?
It's a song called Ethel by Murder Capital, and I think it's one of the most emotionally heartbreaking songs I've heard for a long time. It's beautiful. It's like Interpol maxed out. It's absolutely wonderful. I know Tom has heard of Murder Capital. You recommended them to me at some point. The song Ethel is absolutely beautiful. If you like post-punk Fontaine style guitar stuff, check it out. It's amazing.
So it's a really good nomination, Martyn, but Does It Slap requires 2 of the other people. I know the song, and I agree, but neither of the Dans will have heard of it because it only came out a couple of weeks ago.
Just watching the music video, it's got a very attractive woman smoking melancholy, and it's got 2 chickens cooking in an oven. It's confusing.
I'm in.
Can I then posit I Feel Loved by Donna Summer?
Yes.
Is that on there already?
No. No.
All right,
one of the most important songs ever recorded.
Rhoda is best.
Yeah,
you
can
win
have
the
that
award
one.
for first important.
Without that song, there is no dance music, no Daft Punk, nothing. I'm sure it would have come eventually, but that song is the spiritual successor to. It was Italo disco stemmed from what Moroder did in that song. Very important. Love Donna Summer. Before we get on to tonight's main course, some topical appetizers. Who's got the news? Who's got the blues? Dan B, you're back after a couple of episodes sitting out. So give it to me straight, Dan. What's popping?
I've become very middle-aged and middle class. We're looking at moving house. My recommendation to anybody is don't ever move house.
No.
Stay where you are. Stay indoors. Remain indoors. Moving house is just an absolute scam. You're going to just have to pay money for every little thing that you do, even if it doesn't require any help. Don't do it. Apart from that, done nothing. Just don't move house. Please take that on board.
Sound advice. Tom?
I've been doing a lot of listening to music. I think it will be linked on the blog at some point.
I've already linked it on the blog.
Just it.
I'll keep updating it with each post that I put up on there.
Yeah, this year I'm back on the new releases again. I did a big catch-up session where I listened to about 110 albums in their entirety in the past 3 weeks. 67 of them I liked, the rest of them I didn't. 100 Reasons new album, I'm going to recommend that one here because it's of bands that from the early 2000s that you really wanted to reform and to see live again. 100 Reasons aren't going to be high on that list. Yet this album is every bit as good as they were at their peak. I think Colin Doran's voice is still strong. They've still got a good chorus. It's really poppy. I didn't want to like it. I wanted to go in and think this is just like emo for people who haven't grown up. But it's actually really good. On a completely different note, I'll do more reviews of records on one of our news episodes, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Because I could go on for ages. My band that I'm in with Martyn, I'm going to steal his thunder. We're going into the studio to record an EP on Thursday. We're travelling down to Cornwall on Wednesday, doing that age-old band thing of renting a cottage in Cornwall and recording in the middle of nowhere.
Oh, you're doing it Captain Beefheart.
Yeah, we are that stereotype now. That's what we're doing next week and just been getting ready for that, really.
Cool. Martyn, anything to add?
Yeah, Tom totally stole my thunder because I wanted to talk about going to the recording studio.
That's what he does.
It's going to be, it's what he does. It's going to be my first experience in a professional recording studio. I've recorded at DBS with you, Dan, and we did that whole thing and that was fun. But this is going to be different. It's going to be a whole weekend of just hanging out with the band and recording and in an actual professional recording studio. It's going to blow my mind. I'm going to be like in my absolute heaven. And it's down in Cornwall as well, so I can go out and walk around the cliffs and stuff and get all my muse on and all that. I'm so looking forward to it. It's going to be quite an experience for me personally, because in all of the years I've been playing guitar, the one thing I've always wanted to do is just be in a recording studio and just lay down my parts. That said, I think it's going to make or break the band. It's either going to go really well or it's not. And I just hope it goes well. I can't wait. Anyway, other than that, Tom turned me on to Slow Readers Club. Silly name, but such a great band. Again, part of that whole like Fontaine style.
I hate how Martyn just groups every post-punk band in with Fontaines because I really don't like Fontaines, but I love both Murder Capital and Slow Readers Club. There is post-punk that doesn't sound like Fontaines DC. So these two bands are post-punk bands that don't sound like Fontaines DC but do sound like post-punk. They probably sound closer to early Interpol. Sorry to just jump in there, Marion. No.
Either way, it's great. And I've come to the realization that I haven't listened to shoegaze in a long time. And shoegaze for many years was my number one genre. But I've come to the realization that 80s post-punk is literally my favorite genre. Echo and the Bunnymen, Jesus and Mary Chain, all that stuff. I've been getting into Jesus and Mary Chain again recently, like revisiting them and enjoying them a lot. I think post-punk is, for me, the most perfect genre ever. It's so great. To the point I don't really even listen to shoegaze anymore. I'm so bored of like Ride and all that stuff. Yeah, anyway, that's me.
I have been doing quite a bit of listening, mainly to the Beatles, in preparation for tonight's special. I have listened to every album that they've put out, which was quite the journey. And a lot of their early stuff is very slick, but it's very forgettable. It wasn't until later on that they started to make more interesting projects musically. We'll get onto that in a bit. That's occupied the majority of my time. There have been some new releases which we'll go over CAC News episode on our YouTube channel. We'll be doing another one of those shortly. We'll keep the new releases to that. Gorillaz was mediocre. I didn't enjoy Algiers' new album as much as I thought I would.
I really enjoyed
I know. I'm going to go back into it. Caroline Polachek's album has really engaged me, though. I love that album. I said on Cat News that I was going to go back to it, and I was right to do so, because listening to it on headphones, it's a fantastically produced record with many great moments in it. And I'll be going back to that many times this year, I think.
There is a reason why it's getting 10 out of 10s everywhere. Like, it's not even my style of music particularly, but even I can listen to that and go, oh, it's going to be hard to not see this on Album of the Year lists.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. In terms of general news, we had the passing of Burt Bacharach. He was one of the finest songwriters of the 20th century, with Howl David, Raindrops Keep Falling on My Head, Walk On By, which Dionne Warwick's Walk On By is one of the most perfect pop songs ever recorded. Special shout out as well to the Isaac Hayes cover from his 1969 album Hot Buttered Soul. It's a sprawling masterpiece of a cover, and it really brings out Bacharach's songwriting and arranges it to become larger than life. Nothing that he put to tape himself of particular significance, but it's just when he wrote these hits for other people, they were timeless. Couldn't pass up an opportunity to pay tribute to one of the best.
He was a massive influence on James Dean Bradfield from the Manic Street Preachers, and you can hear it all over Everything Must Go, the album. You can hear that whole like big, massive orchestral sound, very melodic. You can hear it all over the Manic's music after the Holy Bible. Sad.
The only real way that I knew of Burt Bacharach originally was through the Austin Powers movie, when he did What the World Needs Now. And it's just a fantastic song. And then he came back in the next song as well, didn't he? Oh, what did he do in the next one? I remember now.
I'll Never Fall in Love Again?
Yes, that's right. And although that was the only bit that I really knew of him at the time, you look at some of the songs that he's got credit for, and as in writing credits, just incredible. Endless list of songs. So, yeah, very sad. But obviously had a good life, yeah.
Yeah, I think in the 60s and 70s, there was barely a year went by where he didn't win an Academy Award or a Grammy. Pretty much was nominated. It's insane. Like, you look at his you look at the honours list on, just go to his Wikipedia page and look at his honours list, and pretty much every year in the 60s or 70s, you'll find something that he was nominated for. 69, he won both Best Original Score and Best Song, for example, at the Academy Awards. It's pretty nuts.
Yeah, we're talking about somebody whose influence to the DNA of pop music is as fundamentally important as the guys that we're talking about tonight. I think Burt Bacharach is up there. I think that especially if you take the Beatles' individual contributions to music, I would say any of the Beatles as individuals, their songwriting isn't quite there. But Bacharach is better.
Yeah, I think, yeah. And I think that period at the end of the 1960s where Bacharach really comes up is probably the era with the most important music going on. Because you've got Hendrix making rock music rock. You've got the Beatles and the Stones making like rock pop records almost. You've got Steve Reich doing his tape experiments, which go on to create dance music as we know it, and those sorts of sonic experimentations. I'd say dance, electronic music as we know it. And then you've got Burt Bacharach writing songs that are, classics.
It's a fertile period to name check the guy on my t-shirt, Mr. Stone. Funk originated from the late 60s. Sly and the Family Stone, especially Larry Graham's bass work. I listened to There's a Riot Going On from 1971 the other week, and it's such a sparse album, but a really influential and important album. And James Brown was doing similar rhythm experiments after the Famous Flames, when he had the likes of Bootsy Collins in the JBs. It's such a wonderful period, the late 60s. And yeah, we're going to get into it in a bit with perhaps the most important group of the time, because we're about to kick back and we are about to delve into the Beatles. They were only around from 1963 until 1970, so we're talking a 7-year period, which is remarkable. Everybody thinks that they were around for a long time, but they weren't. 7 years. I think it's less time than One Direction spent together as a band. But yet, all of these albums are regularly listed on the lists of greatest albums of all time. So there's got to be something there. The best place to start, I think, is albums. My favourite album is Revolver from 1966. It's their first experimental record, coming off of the back of making Rubber Soul. They'd mastered the slip pop sound, but they introduced Indian elements, sitars. George Harrison was very much into his Buddhist lifestyle. It's one of those records where you listen to it and the songs themselves are quite slight. Most of them are short, but as an experience, they flow so well. And I think that a lot of their other albums are lacking that.
I also went back through all of the albums in order, and I can see this album is a very big turning point in their career, in that it's where they start really using the studio as an instrument and experimenting with recording techniques. Now, I think they got better at that later on. I think the thing for me is this album, so when I was a kid, so this will explain a lot about what comes up from the episode, I had a cassette player in my bedroom for when I was about 3 or 4, something like that. And one of the first cassettes I had was, do you remember they did the Beatles anthology cassette boxes was like, and volume 3 was like 1967 to 69. And that was the one that I had. And I listened to it so much, I think the tape wore out and I can't find it anymore. So that era for me has a lot of nostalgia. So for me, Revolver, I listened back to it. It doesn't have that nostalgia for me because I think a lot of us of our generation, we grew up listening to the Beatles because it's what our parents listened to.
No, I was never a Beatles listener growing up. I didn't start listening to the Beatles probably until I was a teenager at very earliest.
I would say I'm similar as well, where my parents growing up, like my mum, we grew up in the early 90s. My mum used to listen to Radio 1 at the time. So we'd be listening to some pretty terrible early 90s pop. I probably didn't get into them until my early 20s, where you experience music on your own time scale. And I always had this opinion of the Beatles that they were some weird old person, overrated version of One Direction from the 60s, because I didn't know their music. Yeah. Or at least I thought I didn't. That was the thing.
You're thinking of the Monkees.
Yeah, do you know what? I probably was, but obviously at the time I was completely oblivious. I had no idea. I just assumed they were some sort of 60s version of a boy band that had no real substance to them. And now that I've become a lot more familiar with them, I couldn't have been more wrong. And I know people out there think, oh, they are quite simplistic, they are quite basic, whatever. I disagree. I think they've written, between the four of them, just countless classics. Mm-hmm. And yes, they're generally quite shortish, simplish songs, but the range that they have, it really stunned me when I really got into them. They're not just a simple pop band. They were obviously really popular with the girls of the time, and they had that same thing that One Direction had, but they were a lot more musically gifted, I think. And that's what I was really impressed about. Mm-hmm. And Revolver, like Tom said, is a change in their sound, and they do try and get a bit more. Yeah, like George Harrison's Indian influence is definitely showing. I'm going to put a comment out about albums generally, if that's all right.
Yeah.
I don't think the Beatles are a good albums band.
I don't.
Their albums have a few good songs in them each, and then quite a few sort of all right, averagey songs. I think the Beatles are a great band to go, right, let's put their greatest hits on, and you get a good array of various types of music just from listening to some of their, not just their singles, but some of their better known songs, because they are generally the better ones. This album is one of their better ones. I agree with you. When we were asked to pick a favorite album, I don't know if I really have one. I think there's about 3 or 4 albums which are all pretty good, and they've all got great songs on them.
Towards the end of their career, I don't think the albums all necessarily flow that well. I think there are 2 albums that fit together quite well as albums, but I'm not convinced about the rest of them. There is a lot of filler on all of their early records. I think even when their albums flow better towards the end of their careers, there's still a lot of filler. It's just flows in better. This album has 6. For me, there are 6 songs on here that you can say to anyone in the street and they'll know them. You know?
I don't know if I agree.
You've got Taxman, which is a classic. Eleanor Rigby, which is among their most popular
best song
songs.
on this album.
Yeah.
I don't think so. I don't think so.
No,
but
I don't think so either.
I do think, though, in discussing Eleanor Rigby, I believe it may be the greatest second song on an album of all time. It occupies that territory of getting past the intro and setting up for something bigger, and it does it perfectly. Then you've got I'm Only Sleeping.
That's probably not up there. The 6 I had in mind that everyone would be able to sing back to you pretty much would be Taxman, Eleanor Rigby, Here, There and Everywhere, Yellow Submarine, Good Day Sunshine, and Got to Get You Into My Life. They're the 6 that I think everybody knows. Now, I know there are other ones on there that like you guys probably like better, and there are other ones on there that I like better, but those 6, I don't think you can deny that pretty much everyone in the street will know.
Yeah, I wasn't really that familiar with Here, There and Everywhere before. I've heard it many times because I've listened to Revolver many times, but when I revisited it the other day, it felt like filler.
It's the chorus of it. Most people would be able to sing that back to you, I think.
Maybe it's because I didn't get into the Beatles until later in life, because as Dan has said, when I was a kid, I also felt that they were a 60s pop phenomenon in the vein of the Monkees. Growing up, and having a vague awareness of bands from the time, I always assumed that the Beach Boys were the musically talented ones, and then bands like the Monkees and the Beatles were just pop rip-offs of that. But in going back and revisiting a lot of music from that period, I think that Revolver especially is better than Pet Sounds.
Oh, that's fighting talk, man. I am not agreeing with you on that. Not a chance.
I'm with Tom on this one. Man.
There's no way I'm going to agree to that. There's no way.
Sounds is on its own fucking platform.
I love Pet Sounds. I really think it's an exceptional record, but I truly believe that Revolver is the one good album, start to finish. I'm going to walk that back a little bit, because saying that the Beatles only released one good album, it's not something I want to carry while I present a music show.
Just watch the YouTube comments coming in after that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I think it's the one album that I would say I can listen to it, and every track to some extent carries an energy level from start to finish that I don't think the other records have. I'm sure we're going to get onto this, because I think that one of the biggest problems I have with a lot of Beatles albums is their insistence on letting every member of the band have at least one song on the album that they wrote themselves. And I think that many of the Ringo songs across their discography are so much weaker than the other songs that they're writing. But I think that Yellow Submarine is perfect for Revolver. I think that it fits the mood of the rest of the album, to the point where I'd say that on Revolver, Yellow Submarine isn't the worst song. I would say that is For No One, the Paul McCartney joint towards the end. I'd say that's the most boring song on it, and the one I would probably skip 9 times out of 10 if I'm in a rush. Revolver, it comes together for me as a more condensed experience than Pet Sounds. I know they're similar lengths.
Pet Sounds for me, but then Revolver isn't the era of Beatles that I know as well.
Your favourite album?
It was a toss-up, because there are 2 Beatles albums that I would say hang together well as albums, and that's Let It Be, actually surprisingly hangs together very well as an album, and my favourite is Abbey Road. There's a couple of reasons why I go with Abbey Road. It's got like 3 of the strongest songs the Beatles ever recorded on it. The problem I have with the Beatles after Revolver is the Beatles are to English music what Monty Python are to British comedy. They're bringing in this very sort of traditional British whimsy that I absolutely fucking hate.
It's why I don't like Queen.
Exactly, it's the same thing. The thing is, in small doses, that little bit of British whimsy is okay.
Yeah.
But like Sgt. Pepper's, it overwhelms a
It's too
large
much.
number. Yeah, there's too much of it. Whereas Abbey Road, the British whimsy, all the few tracks are like a minute long and strung together in a medley towards the end. It's counteracted by the fact you've got Golden Slumbers in there, which is just beautiful and a minute long. It's a medley of great ideas that they never really fleshed out. It's got Here Comes the Sun on it, which is up there with their best songs. I think it's got Ringo's best song, which is Octopus's Garden.
No.
Come
Absolutely not.
Together on it and Something. They're both fantastic. as
Yeah,
well.
I think I really loved, as a kid, I always loved Maxwell's Silver Hammer.
Nope.
And I think, and I love that track. The vocal performance on Oh Darling is really good. She Came In Through the Bathroom Window, I've always loved.
That's a great song. I like
Since
that
I was a kid, and it's less than 2 minutes long. So yeah, it's got a lot of their strongest songs. For me, I don't think there's any filler, and the bits that are close to being filler are short enough for it not to matter.
I think that potentially it could be their best record. I think it's one of the few times where the track listing makes sense. Come Together, you open with that. That makes sense. The ending of it, where it goes into the end and that tiny little Her Majesty skit at the end. But the end is a perfect ending to their career.
Yeah.
This being the latest album that they ever recorded. Let It Be was actually recorded before Abbey Road.
Yeah.
Problem I have with Abbey Road, though, is it contains Maxwell's Silver Hammer and Octopus's Garden in the first half, and I hate both of those songs. Come Together and Something are brilliant, and then until you get to I Want You, She's So Heavy, I'm completely done with the album by then. It takes a lot of effort for me to get back on board, which they do. It's over an 8.5 out of 10 record. We're talking a great record. I just don't think it's as exceptional as Revolver.
I disagree, obviously.
Yeah.
I think
But that's what we're here for.
Yeah, it's what we're here for. I think for me, there were 3 Beatles records that my mum had on vinyl when I was a kid. And that was Rubber Soul, Abbey Road, and Let It Be was the one she used to put on the most often, actually. I chatted to her about it, and she was annoyed I didn't pick Let It Be. She maintains it actually, at the time, hung together better as an album. And she maybe has a point. For their late era, it's quite a concise record. But the reason for going for Abbey Road is I have great nostalgia for, if you got into listening to Maxwell's Silver Hammer when you were about 5,
I
you'd
can
absolutely
see, yeah.
love it. Octopus's Garden as well. We didn't own a TV when I was a kid. I used to watch VHS tapes at my grandparents' house, was the only TV I got. So Octopus's Garden, for me as a 5-year-old, was the perfect song to be sung by the guy who narrated Thomas the Tank Engine on VHS tapes. I have nostalgia for those 2 tracks that I don't have for anything on Revolver, and I don't have for anything on Sgt. Pepper's. When I say about the whimsy side of it and not liking that, I don't like any of that I'm approaching as an adult, but the stuff when I approached it as a little kid, I can like that.
I think with Let It Be, it's much maligned for the production. Phil Spector produced it as opposed to George Martin, who regularly handled their production. And a lot of people don't like the massive orchestral wall of sound trademark that he has. I think that's unfair. I do actually think that it sounds fine. The problem I have with Let It Be is the track listing. I think that starting an album with 2 of us makes no sense. When you're finishing an album with Get Back, that is the perfect album opener. And it winds up being tacked
It should
on
probably
to the
end with The Long and Winding Road, shouldn't it,
Yes.
really?
Yeah, or Let
That's
It Be.
such a great song. Yeah.
Yeah, one of
Those
the 2
are the 3
ballads.
standout tracks.
Yeah. Other than that, there isn't anything exceptional on the record. Across the Universe is okay. Dig a Pony's great.
I love that track. I've always liked 2 of Us. And Let It Be, we used to sing in our primary school choir. It may not be their finest moment, but it's definitely catchy and deserves a bit of recognition.
Martyn, what's your favourite Beatles album?
It's going to be Sgt. Pepper's, and I'll give only 2 words why. OK Computer. Sgt. Pepper's was, like Tom said earlier, it was a band that used the studio as an instrument. and it absolutely changed the way that bands make music. It wasn't just, oh, we've written songs and we'll record them. It's what do we have at our disposal? Everything, then let's use everything. So for me, it's Sgt. Pepper's because it's a production masterpiece. It's absolutely wonderful. And the songs aren't the best, but that's not the point. It's about the way that the musicians work with the producers and with the stuff that they had in the room. It's a very gestalt way of working as a musician, and I absolutely fucking love it. Also, the drum parts on Sgt. Pepper's, the song. Everyone slags on Ringo as a drummer, but nah, he was good.
He was good.
Oh, he has moments of being very good. But for the vast majority of most of the albums, he plays like he's bored or high or both. But every now and then he pulls
like Meg
something
White.
out.
That's what I had in my notes. He is Meg White before Meg White was born.
Yeah. He did what he needed to do, and it fit perfectly, because if he was a better drummer than he was, it probably would have taken away from a lot of the other stuff that was going on in the band.
It gives it room to breathe.
There are a couple of tracks where I definitely think he gets the drum beat so wrong to listen to. Dear Prudence, the drum beat underneath that is just so incongruous. I really don't like it. Like, that is a really good song ruined by a drum beat, because the way he's playing with the time center just really annoys me.
I'm going to disagree with that. I think his drum part on that song is perfect.
Oh, I know, it really jars with me.
It's not right, and that's the point. It's off, and that's the beautiful thing about it.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like it's deliberately off, though. That's the thing. It sounds like a drummer who can't think of anything better to play.
That makes it even better. The fact that he played to his limitations. He knew that he was no Keith Moon or John Bonham. He was just like doing what he did and fit the music perfectly.
If you're a studio technician, that album is the ground zero of weird techniques to get different sounds out of instruments. Exhibit A being the final track, A Day in the Life. Just that final note. It took so many people playing the same note on a piano, the way that they recorded it to echo and service the crescendo to the album. It's amazing and it is so inventive. But the songs, if I ever have to listen to Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kitely ever again, I'll be a sad panda.
I will listen to Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band over and over again and never get bored. It's fucking beautiful.
It does have some great songs on it. Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds is a classic.
Oh, come on. Yeah.
I cannot stand Ringo Starr's version of With a Little Help from My Friends. I much prefer the cover by Joe Cocker because it brings energy to it, but it's still a good song. Getting Better. Fixing a Hole.
When I'm 64, I quite like that.
Yeah, that's a good song. Within You, Without You is amazing, but the rest of it's filler. I like about 4 songs on it out of 13, and for me, it's not got a good enough hit rate for me.
That's a good point. It's not about the songs. It's about the revolutionary way in which they absolutely changed the way music is made. If it wasn't for Sgt. Pepper's, you would have no Radiohead. It's as simple as that. One of the most important albums of all time.
It's important to remember that when we're discussing the Beatles, because we're not just discussing some songs that were made in a 7-year period. There's so many facets to what makes them so relevant in 2023. Many decades after they finished recording as a band, we're still talking about them as a culture. Society still has time for the Beatles. And it's because there's other facets, such as the impact that they had on recording techniques and the way that they became so famous as individuals within the context of a band. So they were the first band where people would have a favourite member of the band. Before that, it was just you're either the front man or that's it. Nobody knows who the horn player is. They brought personality to pop culture.
What massive bands were anywhere near as big as them before this? They were the first ever giant band, really, when you think about it. Before that, you had lots of very big solo artists, or you'd know the lead singer, but you wouldn't know like the instrumentals behind them.
Yeah, it was composers. So somebody who'd be popular would be Duke Ellington, and it would be his orchestra playing songs that he'd composed. Whereas when the Beatles become big, suddenly it's the people making the music that are the celebrities fronting the whole thing, and they've gained this mass popularity, a hysteria, and suddenly they're accessible to children, teenagers. They almost created pop culture as you know it today.
And what's odd is they did it by essentially starting off with quite derivative pop rock.
Yeah.
Really. Yeah. Like their first record particularly wasn't doing anything particularly new, but sold loads.
Yeah.
And all their follow-ups did. This is what I find odd about the Beatles. We remember them now for the late 60s to the 70s, for the choruses on, and I think as well, the other reason we remember the Beatles now is their songs always sound better in your head than they do on the record. Bear with me on this. So, if you walk round, you can sing the chorus to Yesterday, or probably the whole song, off by heart, and in your head, that song sounds amazing on the recording. And then you go back and listen to the recording, and it's a little bit insipid.
It's basic.
Yeah, strength of the vocal parts, particularly, is why and the recordings. I find it amazing how they got big off the back of doing stuff that everyone else was doing well, and then they just carried on, and then they didn't do the weird experimental stuff until after they were already the biggest band in the world.
They were covering the Isley Brothers and contemporary acts. If you put on any of their early 60s albums, it doesn't sound any better than something that any rock and roll or soul R&B bands were putting out. It's all very much just generic 3-minute pop songs.
I think you've also got to remember as well, the Beatles were 4 lads from Liverpool who hung out as mates, and they were all very good looking lads. And like, it goes beyond the music. It goes into like the image as well. They looked good on posters, didn't they?
Speaking of image, how is Tom all 4 of the Beatles on Please Please Me? I had a look at that cover, and I couldn't tell which one you looked like most. So I came to the conclusion that you are all 4 of on that album cover. You're a pop culture icon, Tom.
Yeah, something like that. If only that was in fashion today, I'd be sorted.
Dan, what's your favourite Beatles album? You haven't said.
I don't really have one. I know we were forced to pick one. When I want to sit on the fence.
At gunpoint.
Go behind the scenes here and say that we were made to pick one. Conveniently, should I say, I picked one that nobody else had done. Although, again, I could be swayed for any of the other 3, to be honest with you. I went for the White Album, or the self-titled album. But it's got problems, don't get me wrong.
Oh, yeah.
It's the longest of all the albums.
Did you listen to it in full?
No, I did not.
Yes.
Nobody listens to the White Album.
Because I got fed up with it. So there you go. It's my favourite in the way that it's got a few tracks that I really like. I really like Back in the USR. I really like Blackbird, While My Guitar Gently Weeps. I love those songs.
Yeah.
I said it earlier. Every album has a few songs that I love. I think it follows on a little bit from Revolver in that it's got that sort of experimental style to it. They do, again, I think you said it, Dan, that because there's 4 different people writing different songs, there's a real range to the collection. And sometimes that works, where you go, oh, look, it's got a song like this and a song like that. That's great. It's real nice variety. And then other times you go, oh, it's all over the place. I think it works in part in this album, but it just goes on for about 30 minutes too long.
Yeah, I think this album has the highest number of classics on it of any of their albums. But that's 1,000 Monkeys with 1,000 Typewriters, isn't it?
It was the best of times. It was the blurst of time.
If you're going to make a 90-minute double album in 1968. Nowadays, putting out a 90-minute double album when bands on average release an album every 3 or 4 years, it's impressive, but putting out a 90-minute double album when you released an album the year before is
and the year after.
Even like every prolific artist who's releasing albums like that is going to put a shed load of filler on that 90-minute album.
Yeah.
Looking at you, Prince.
hey, okay, I'm saying it now. I think Emancipation is a more enjoyable listen than the White Album.
No.
It's twice as long, but that's because I'm a Prince fan. You're right. I think it does have the most highlights of any Beatles album on it because it's got some really excellent tracks. Back in the USR, Dear Prudence, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, Happiness is a Warm Gun, Blackbird, Why Don't We Do It in the Road, Sexy Sadie, Helter Skelter, and the one that I actually hated but now think is genius is Revolution 9. When you get to that 8 minutes 22 seconds, upon listening to the rest of the album, does it build enough to earn that status as an experimental bit of history.
Congratulations, you're the first one who ever did that.
Yeah, I listened to it all the way through, and it makes Revolution 9 work because of how big the album is. Good Nights at the end, but Revolution 9 is this culmination of all they've been doing up until that point. I think it does work, but only in the context of the full album. Outside of that, it's just random noises. We'll move on to songs, because it goes hand in hand with a lot of the album talk. So my favourite song is also on Revolve, and my favourite song is the closing track, which is Tomorrow Never Knows. And I think Ringo Starr's drumming makes this song exceptional. I think it's absolutely brilliant what he does on that. Because of his limitations, nobody else would think to play such a clunky, tom-based drum beat, and I think it's phenomenal. It's got just the right amount of sitar fading in at the start with George Harrison's influence there. The vocals are great. It's got weird sound effects. It's only a few minutes long. It's funky, which is not found on many of their records, danceable sound. And I just think it has everything that I want from a Beatles track. The moment I loved Tomorrow Never Knows is from a TV show. Martyn, you'll be familiar with this. There is an episode of Mad Men where Don Draper sits down at the very end of the episode and puts on Tomorrow Never Knows. It represents how things are different from this point.
Got goosebumps.
It's a culture shift.
Absolutely.
And that song resonated with me then. I watched that show maybe about 5-6 years ago, and I've still never been able to shake that song. The song that I will go back to the most, the Beatles. There are other songs that I love, with a lot of Beatles songs, either the ballads or the more high concept songs, sometimes I have to be in a specific mood to seek it out and listen to it. Whereas Tomorrow Never Knows, I can put that on any playlist, whether it's amongst Prince songs, whether it's amongst David Bowie songs, whether it's amongst even some hip hop. It's got a similar beat. It sounds like something that an early 90s hip hop record could have employed as a sample. I just think it fits everywhere, and it's an exceptional piece of music.
I absolutely agree with everything you just said, and I'm really fucking angry at you for choosing that song because I wanted to choose that song. It's my favourite Beatles song too. It's a proto-shoegaze song. It is just absolute beautiful, like a drone is what a lot of my favourite bands do. They'll take one chord, and you don't need a bridge, you don't need a chord progression, you don't need a chorus or anything like that. Just like one chord, but fucking noise experimentation over the top, and that's all you need. I fucking adore this song so much. Ringo's drumming is the best thing about it. It's just a wonderful tune. Being a big Brian Jonestown Massacre fan, you can definitely hear where this song was so important in that San Francisco new psychedelia movement that I'm really into. It's not even really a song. It's a piece of music. It's an exploration of musical sound.
It's one of the few recordings from the Beatles that I think sounds massively ahead of its time. I think a lot of Beatles songs, even though they're timeless classics, that they were recorded in the late 60s, whereas if you heard Tomorrow Never Knows and you didn't know what it was, it could pass for a late 70s record.
It could have been recorded yesterday and it would still sound fucking amazing.
It could be on Remain in Light by Talking Heads. It's that
absolutely.
kind of vibe.
It would have fitted quite well in a lot of what was happening in the mid-1990s as well. It's a very good piece of psychedelia. Mm-hmm. This is one of those times when I say that Ringo Starr isn't the greatest drummer and he doesn't always get it. I will agree on this one. He does get it right. It's a great piece of psychedelia and I can totally see why you like it. And it's great.
There's a great cover of Tomorrow Never Knows by, they never did it live, but when Ride did it, you would think that Ride wrote it. It's very early 90s shoegaze. You wouldn't have known it was a Beatles song if you didn't know. It's that good. Fucking perfect song. You bastard for choosing that.
Sorry. Yeah,
So-
what's your favourite, Tom?
I went for something really obvious, actually. But as a bass guitarist, it's got to be Come Together. Frankly. Because it's one of those bass guitar lines. Every bass guitarist at some point will try and play it because it's really simple and it sounds really cool.
I actually discovered that song through a cover. And that cover was on the second disc of History, The Greatest Hits Michael Jackson's collection from 95. And his version is basically the same, but he's just put glossy, because he recorded it, I think it was recorded in 88, because it's actually in Moonwalker, the movie. He does a live performance with Steve Stevens on guitar, I believe. And the cover is very much a straight cover with different production values from a different period. I went back and discovered the Beatles version, and it's much better, a lot more raw. John Lennon's vocals on that song are great. And it's another example. There's a bit of funk in there as well. They clearly did their blues homework that day. Yeah. And it's a great song.
Yeah, the reason for picking this isn't just because it's a great bass line, because it is a great bass line, but it's one of those songs that it's very catchy. Everybody knows it.
It has weird lyrics for a song that everybody knows. A lot of their songs were very esoteric. They were referring to in-jokes. They even had fun with the whole Paul is dead rumour, and they started constructing lyrics that were designed to be difficult to read into just because they knew that their lyrics were going to be studied. There's an interview where John Lennon said that it doesn't actually mean anything. It would just be fun to create something where people will study it in classrooms when it doesn't actually have a real meaning, which I think is expert level trolling for the mid-60s.
That's what he was good at.
Dan, what's your favourite Beatles song?
It took me a long time to choose. I went in the end with the one that I've always said is my favourite, because I must have said that for a reason. I went for Here Comes the Sun.
Good choice.
It's
nice
it's a lovely song.
Yeah.
It makes me feel both happy and sad at the same time. It's uplifting, yet there are somber moments in it, and I like the way that makes me feel. It's just a nice, simple, classic song.
Did you get into it through the Gary Barlow cover?
I didn't know there was a Gary Barlow cover, so I guess not.
You also
Thankfully
didn't need to know there was a Gary Barlow cover. So
now I need to go and find that.
It was one of the supermarkets. It was either Morrison's or Sainsbury's, I'm sure. And they used a Gary Barlow cover of Here Comes the Sun.
I hope that supermarket has gone out of business.
Yeah, I hope so too.
I was struggling. I wanted to choose. I wrote a list of songs that I wanted to go for. And in the end, it was between Here Comes the Sun and A Hard Day's Night.
A classic. It's one of their best early songs.
Yeah, it is. My son Alex is learning to play the guitar at the moment.
Oh, cool.
And we've been listening to quite a lot of Beatles together. And it was like just random last night. He suddenly went, I think I've worked out how to play the cool bit from A Hard Day's Night. And he started writing the notes. He drew the stave, he ran it down, then he played it. And it wasn't quite right, but it was just one of those moments that you have. And you think, that's music being passed on to a new generation, and it was really special as a dad to watch that. Special moment for me. I like a lot of their more meaningful songs. I like Let It Be. I like Yesterday. I like that sort of track. I don't like Yellow Submarine and that type of track that they do. Ticket to Ride, Day Tripper. Oh, there's so many good ones.
When you said at the start, they're not necessarily an albums band. I think there's two greatest hits collections from 1973. There's the red one, which is 1962 to 1966. And there's the blue one, which is 67 to 70. If you've got both of those, you don't really need a lot else. Because all of their best songs are on there from all their periods. There are so many.
Yeah. I've just got to shout out Penny Lane because no one's mentioned that yet.
Why have I not mentioned Penny Lane?
Yeah,
fantastic.
Strawberry
I know,
Fields
it's
Forever.
fantastic. Yeah, we haven't mentioned that either. God, what's wrong with us?
Yeah, nobody's mentioned Obla Dee Obla Da.
I nearly mentioned it in a negative way.
Yeah.
I loved that one as a kid, so I can't slag that off.
A lot of the songs are almost, especially Ringo songs and Paul McCartney to a lesser extent, a lot of them seem to be almost written for a younger audience. So if you're not somebody who knew them as a kid, it's really difficult to go back in later and go, oh, yeah, I really like Octopus's Garden. It just doesn't make any sense if you're not a kid, but I can understand if you've grown up on it, then it holds that nostalgia. Martyn, did you have a second favourite after I stole your first?
Yeah, you did steal my first, but my second favourite is She Said, which is literally the perfect pop song. It's just the most simplest of riffs. It's such a great little song. It's very short. It just does what it says on the tin.
it's time to explore our favourite individual Beatle, because I think help put some light on some of the opinions that we've had and why we favour particular songs. I've got a bit of a theory with the individual members, and I'll explain who is my favourite. But I think that if I'm looking at the Beatles as a band, I think that John Lennon is the head. I think that Paul McCartney is the heart. Ringo Starr is the body, not like in a Jesse Ventura way. George Harrison is the balls. John, he drives the band ideologically. A lot of political ideas come from John Lennon. You can tell that from his stuff. And that as a kid growing up, I always thought John Lennon was the lead singer of the Beatles. It's not the case. If you're not too familiar with them, that can come across, especially considering that he died earliest. He's built up as this legendary figure that died far too early. If you're coming from an outsider's perspective, he can be seen as the lead singer. So it makes sense for him to be the head, the face of the band. I think Paul's the musical heart. I think deep down, I think Paul McCartney is the most musically talented member of the Beatles, purely from a melodical perspective anyway. I think he's responsible for some of the most poignant moments, some of the most heartfelt ballads. But if he does skip a beat, we end up with palpitations that sounds like Maxwell's Silver Hammer, which sucks. I think that Ringo, as the body, he grounds the group. He's got these underrated grooves. He's not the best body, because that would have been Pete Best, but his idiosyncrasies, without them, it isn't the Beatles. But he should absolutely never be given any autonomy under any circumstances whatsoever, as he's completely devoid of taste. And finally, I think that George is the dark, brooding force that provides a bit of grit with his guitar. I think with George Harrison being the balls of the band, he's a constant presence, but you only get small flashes. They are often the most memorable bangers. My personal taste, I am a George Harrison fan. I've been back and forth. I've listened to multiple McCartney recordings, multiple Lennon recordings. I haven't listened to any Ringo Starr albums. He's got one single that came out post-Beatles that's worth listening to, and I can't even remember the name of it. I think the only thing Ringo did that after the Beatles, other than Thomas the Tank Engine, and making that hilarious YouTube video where he tells people that he's not signing any fan mail anymore with peace and love. Other than that, the only thing of note he did was working with Sheila E. from Prince's band. With George Harrison, I think I love George Harrison the most, not because I like balls. I do like balls, my own, but I think All Things Must Pass is the most capable record that any of the Beatles made on their own. I think it's better than the White Album. Pound for pound, he has the best songs within the Beatles. He doesn't get to write that many, but I think when he does, he's got a better success ratio than Paul McCartney and John Lennon. He is a bit of an Indophile, though. So everything ends up being about Hare Krishnas with sitars over it. So you've got that risk. But I think all of the Beatles are essential. I think you can't have the Beatles without those four people. I don't think any of them had a special solo career. Even John Lennon, he was only making records for 10 years after the Beatles. And I think by 75, he'd lost his mojo. I loved the early stuff with the Plastic Ono Band. Cold Turkey, Instant Karma are great. After that, Imagine.
Double Fantasy.
Double Fantasy is okay. Half of it's okay. The other half is Yoko Ono. And I'm not a Yoko hater. I do appreciate what she brings to John and his art. And I think she does have a place on some of those songs in the background. But on Double Fantasy, he puts her up front on half of the record. I'm not listening to that ever again.
I don't mind it. I think his songs are all stronger than hers, but his songs are very strong.
Starting Over is a good final single to go out on.
Yeah, I think so. George Harrison, the best thing he did after the Beatles, he was in the Travelling Wilburys, wasn't he?
Yes, he was.
Yeah.
But he wasn't one of the best members of the Travelling Wilburys.
It's really hard to say who the best members of the Travelling Wilburys. You go through who's in the Travelling Wilburys.
Jeff Flynn.
Or Tom Petty, or Roy Orbison.
It's Roy Orbison. It's Roy Orbison is the correct answer.
No, it's not. It's Jeff Flynn. Jeff Flynn was the best member of the Travelling Wilburys.
They also managed to do some trolling, didn't they? Because they only made 2 albums.
Yeah, Volume 1 and 3.
Yeah, Volume 1 and Volume 3.
That's a great joke. I like that one. George Harrison's solo career, it's fine after All Things Must Pass. I just think he saved up all his best records for that massive triple album. And then everything else was just above average. Got My Mind Set on You, which we've discussed on the podcast before, I think is an okay song. It's a cover as well. I don't think he did anything truly exceptional after that. But yeah, The Travelling Wilburys is a highlight.
For me, John Lennon is my favourite Beatle. I'm afraid it's contradictory, just jumping
Yes.
in now. According to the mythology, at any rate, he's very much the driving force behind the band. I think he's got the strongest vocal. I think he clearly has a larger role than McCartney in the songs that I tend to find the stronger on their records. He brought the experimental edge, I think, later, particularly judging by what he went on to do with the solo records and what he was doing in his solo records at the time when the Beatles were still together. I think a lot of the experimentation comes from him and his wanting to do that. And I actually really like Imagine.
I think Imagine's fine.
Of the Beatles, I think his solo output proves everything I liked about the band really came from him.
Paul McCartney's solo career, there isn't a word that I can...
It's not very
use.
good.
It's not even that, because there's a lot of it. He's been by far the most prolific, and not just because he's still alive. Yeah, he is still. Even before Lennon died, McCartney was making the most albums. He has McCartney in 1970, straight after they break up, which is, I think, okay, but ends amazingly with Maybe I'm Amazed, which is one of the greatest songs any of them made. Then Ram, which is okay. It steers too much into indie folk for me to really get on board with it. Then a lot of the Wings albums are very mediocre. Band on the Run is an exceptional song, but there's...
isn't it? Have you listened back to it recently? This is my problem. Yeah. Band on the Run is half of an exceptional song.
It's two good songs. Right,
two songs, one good, one not so good, that have been jammed together. It's funny because it seems like nearly every Wings song is very much working in the same way that A Day in the Life worked. The Beatles, it's almost like you can't write a verse and a chorus that fit together. So you'll just write two songs and cut them up and stick them together. They're not even necessarily in the same freaking key. And
you've got the verse bit that's like all synth driven, which is boring. But then when the band on the run, that comes in, that's good.
Yeah. And then it goes back to being shit again. It's a good chorus and not much else. That's true with a lot of Wings.
It's true with a lot of his solo stuff, not just the Wings stuff.
I'm more familiar with the Wings stuff. And then he did duets with Michael Jackson, which are painful.
Say's a good song. I like Say, but The Girl Is Mine is dog shit.
It's one of the worst songs I think I've ever heard.
It ruins Thriller. How do you ruin the biggest selling album of all time? You put that song on it.
Yeah. And then you've also got Mull of Kintyre, Frog Chorus.
Just pretend exists. Let's ignore
Frog Chorus
those.
is the worst thing any of them ever did, I think.
Oh, but it was so great on Rupert Bear. That was on that TV program.
It was.
It was great. That was probably my first Paul McCartney I ever heard.
Oh, really?
I reckon it probably was. If I think back, that was probably when I was about 4 that I watched that. In spite of the Frog Chorus, he is who I would vote as my favourite Beatle.
I'm glad we can have some talent.
Because I just think he was the most talented musician. Probably why I'm going to go with him. There is a quote which is misquoted. It's not actually John Lennon, but apparently, I think it was Jasper Carrott, the comedian, who made this quote, but people have attributed it to John Lennon. A reporter apparently says, "Is Ringo the best drummer in the world?" And Lennon apparently says, "He's not even the best drummer in the Beatles."
Yeah.
What he's implying there was that Paul McCartney was the best drummer in the Beatles. Because actually, when Ringo quit briefly during the recording of the White Album, he recorded the drums for Back in the USR and a couple of other tracks.
Oh, okay.
And they were really good. So not only was he a very good drummer, but obviously his bass playing was phenomenal.
That's the one thing that I will give him is that
Tom's
in the
gonna
Beatles,
have a point on that one.
Oh yeah, in the Beatles, the way that he plays bass guitar is hugely influential on what came after. If you listen to interviews with the big bass guitarists of the prog acts, who then influenced everybody, you'd speak people like Chris Squire, Geddy Lee, they will all, and even actually Lemmy from Motorhead, will all tell you that the way Paul McCartney plays bass guitar is what influenced the way they played. That's how important as a bass player is, because he's got a very melodic... So what he's doing with his bass guitar is most of the time he's not just playing the guitar riff. He's not just playing a root note. He's making the bass guitar play a riff in its own right which up until that point did happen, but it wasn't common. That's what he did so well. I will forgive him. I won't forgive him the frog chorus for his bass playing.
You should.
But I nearly will.
The thing I think that sums it up, again, I've got a real quote from John Lennon this time. He said, "Paul is one of the most innovative bass players. Half the stuff that's going on now is directly ripped off from his Beatles period. He's an egomaniac about everything else, but his bass playing, he'd always be a bit coy about." And I think that bit at the end really sums it up. You can tell Paul McCartney's an absolute egomaniac.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that he's actually quite coy and quite subdued about it means actually he knows this is the thing I'm actually pretty special at. And I think it shows in the music. If you've seen any of the documentary on Disney Plus back, some of the little things when they're just jamming, he just comes up with these little bits and you can hear the beginnings of what go on to be some of their other songs. He's just got a really good natural, I think, ability to come up with just cool sounding bass riffs just out of nowhere. And I think that's really talented. That's why he's my favorite. I also another reason my favorite, I prefer his vocals to John Lennon. I like John Lennon's vocals, but I prefer some of the more ballady songs that we talked about. And to be honest, I think McCartney's the lead vocalist on most of the ones I like. He does seem like a bit of a prick though.
Yeah, you're speaking to somebody who's just spent the last week, and I've listened to, I think, 6 Paul McCartney albums in a week, which is too many for anybody, even Paul McCartney. I think that he is incredibly talented, and that's why I think he is almost like the heart of the Beatles. And I think you're right, he's a phenomenal bass player, but he has no filter, and he just insists on, for every great song that he releases, there are 5 awful songs that he's put out with and promoted as heavily. Just from some notes on his solo material, if you'll indulge me.
We're on about best Beatle, not best solo artist. Okay, let's clarify that.
It's important to measure the solo material as much as it is within the Beatles, because I think it allows you to see why they fell apart, because they were all so different. And I think if they'd all stayed in harmony, the Beatles would have been a better group. I think they fell apart because they were all chasing love in different avenues. Paul McCartney fell in love with Linda, and John Lennon had Yoko Ono. George Harrison was married to Patti Boyd, who would go on to have an affair with Eric Clapton and inspire the song Wonderful Tonight. Fun fact about Wonderful Tonight, it features an early appearance of Marcella Detroit, who would then go on to be in Shakespeare's Sister. In terms of listening to Paul McCartney solo records, McCartney 2 is a fine album, but all the high end sounds like Paul was spending quite a lot of time in the bathroom and just decided to move the equipment to him. But all he could carry were funny Echo Kids microphones. It has more energy than the first album, though. Good to see him try some new wave style music. When he moved on from Wings, I think he became, for 1 or 2 albums, he became a bit more urgent. A few bugbears on the album, though. The song Temporary Secretary, for 1 bar of it, he sings Temporary Secrétaire, when if he'd sung the full line in French, switching up for Secrétaire Temporaire would work. It would be a more interesting switch. But then who am I to argue with a guy that wrote pledge.meatfreemondays.com? You can do it right now, please. I think Waterfalls from that album is a pretty good song. The egregiously titled Frozen Jap, that sounds like he'd been listening to Low by David Bowie, about 3 years too late though. There's a tune called Dark Room, that's really cool. But one of my biggest problems, and that leads me on to this with Paul McCartney, you said this, Dan, about his vocals. I think he is a fantastic vocalist, but he has this tendency to do all these silly voices all the time. Cod reggae accents and really offensive African stereotypical voices. And it really grinds my gears when I'm listening to Paul McCartney, because he could have just done it in a straight voice. He's got a lot of soul in his voice. If you listen to Hey Jude, the outro of that, his voice is amazing. He's screaming like a soul singer. Tug of War, the album afterwards, is okay, but it ends with Ebony and Ivory. He does a great collaboration with Stevie Wonder. The song What's That You're Doing is really funky. It's the funkiest thing that George Martin ever produced, because he got George Martin back for that record. But a lot of his stuff, it's largely boring. And to paraphrase James Murphy, he was losing his edge to kids from France and London and Gary, Indiana and Minneapolis, Minnesota. He just lost his edge. And he didn't really have anything to offer pop music after that. He became irrelevant, and he's still chasing that to this day. Some great experiments. He has some Latin stuff on Dress Me Up Like a Robber. It sounds like Tame Impala 30 years before it comes out. But he can't help but ruin himself by finishing albums with Ebony and Ivory and putting the Pipes of Peace to open up a record, or doing the Frog chorus. He's just got no filter. He makes exceptional records and then ruins them by following up with 3 shit records. That's why I don't like Paul McCartney.
John Lennon was his edge. And
Yeah.
I think, and Paul McCartney grounded John Lennon. I think the two of them together is what works so well. Lennon added some bite and some critical appraisal to Paul McCartney's work. And Paul McCartney reined in John Lennon's. You listen to the solo records that John Lennon and Yoko Ono were putting out while the Beatles were together, and you realise that Revolution 9 was about as far as Paul McCartney was willing to let John Lennon go.
Yeah.
Because he was ready to go further than that when he makes records that are like 45 minutes of noise. So the two of them cancelled each other out. I find that Paul McCartney's voice, because he always puts an affectation, like his voice on something like Yesterday just sounds really quite thin. And I think, so in the Beatles, I think generally I prefer John's vocals, but then every now and then Paul McCartney will absolutely belt it. And you're like, where did that come from? Why don't you do that all the time?
Martyn, who was your favourite?
I was going to say Lennon until Bellin started talking about Paul McCartney, and I was like, actually, yeah, you're right. Paul McCartney was the fucking best musician in the Beatles. But no, I'm going to go Lennon, and for one reason, Cold Turkey.
Oh, what a song.
Cold Turkey is just one of my favourite songs of all time. It's absolutely incredible, and that's why I love Lennon. I think Lennon was rock and roll. I think Bellin was right in the sense that Paul McCartney was a consummate musician. George Harrison too. I should be saying George Harrison being a guitar player, because George Harrison's one of the greatest guitar players of all time. But now it's Lennon, man. He was rock and roll. He absolutely just 100%. Just, he was a visionary. It wasn't just about music for him. It was about like the whole sense of wild abandon, which I love in music.
He wanted to change the world, didn't he? I think.
Yeah, he did. He really did. And he was a shit bloke as well. He was not a very nice man.
Domestic abuser.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what I like. I like the fact that you have a very...
That's not the take to have, man.
That needs to be the first bit of the podcast.
Of all the things I like about the Beatles, the best bit was the domestic abuse.
You've got 3 of us with our heads in our hands.
I know, right?
Come on, man.
Yeah.
Put the shovel down.
Oh, Jesus. Yeah, but the thing is about Lennon, he was 100% authentic, and I love authenticity in my music. He's such a genius musician, a shit person, genius musician, and unfortunately, we have a lot of those. We have really amazing musicians who are not very nice people. And what I think was really great about Lennon was it showed that up. It showed you can be a musical genius, but you don't necessarily have to be a decent person. I'm not standing up for that at all whatsoever, but in the post-Me Too era, don't hero worship your musicians, because they might not be very good people. And it's that whole separating the art from the artist thing it's very big on my radar. Beck's a Scientologist, for fuck's sake. Separate the art from the artist.
Yeah, exactly. This conversation tends to come up more and more when we go back into the past and do specials on legacy artists. Not all of them are nice people. And no. John Lennon, I think he was quite open about it later in his life. He did talk about how I think there's a quote that says that he used to hit people and beat women if he didn't get his way. So he was aware of it, and he did try and change. And as somebody who is preoccupied with finding out more and more about leftist values and socialism myself, I do admire some of Lennon's tenacity with the political message of his work. I don't always think that it was that well directed. I think sometimes the message got lost a little bit. I think for instance, in Imagine, I can see what he's getting at in terms of it's ultimately a song about leftist revolution, but I think that it's a bit overly simplistic. When you have lines like "Imagine no possession," people then have that unfortunate misinterpretation of what he was getting at as just being like a hippie in a commune, and we should all abandon our possessions. When you look at Karl Marx, it talks about private property, and I think that's what John Lennon was getting at, the abolition of private property, as opposed to not owning a phone or he had a bigger message, but I think that the simplistic lyrics of that song do it a disservice.
I agree totally. And I think the thing for me about Lennon was he just highlighted the fact that he was in probably the most important and biggest band of all time. And everyone looks at the members of the Beatles as being like, they're great musicians and stuff. But looking behind the surface of what was going on with them, there was some serious issues going on. Lennon was not a nice man. And that kind of carries through to quite a lot of the musicians that we look up. Pretty much every single musician that we all hero worship probably had some problematic stuff going on in their life, their personal life. And Lennon is the standard bearer for not hero worshipping your heroes.
Yeah, like Chuck Berry or James Brown.
Yeah, Jimmy Page.
You talk about the sort of anger between the members of the band. I think there could be an argument for the fact that without that tension, they maybe wouldn't have produced as interesting things. If they just said, do you know what, John, you go and do everything and then we'll play it. And then, do you know what, I think without them having those arguments, having that constructive criticisms against each other, maybe some of the songs wouldn't have turned out as well as they did.
Yeah, I think that's why Revolver's my favourite album. If you listen to that album, I get the sense that they all had the same mission statement in their head, and they put aside their differences and collaborated as a unit. Whereas the later albums, from the White Album, Let It Be, Sgt. Pepper's, Abbey Road, I think that you can hear that they're almost albums that are made by four people making four different albums, as opposed to four people making the same album. It's one of the most talked about subjects in pop music history, the Beatles. I don't think we're going to provide any astoundingly new takes. And I think that people will either judge our opinions to be good or not based on the conversation so far. But I think one thing that you can deny about the Beatles is that they have one of the biggest legacies of any pop act ever. And I think the best way to end this podcast, round off tonight's discussion, is by taking a few examples of songs that came after the Beatles that were directly inspired by them in the form of cover versions. There are a number of great cover versions. I did want to start. One of the things, when I grew up and I wasn't that familiar with the Beatles, I was aware of several Beatles covers. I seem to think it's probably a bad take, but most Beatles covers are better than the...
Agreed.
You are wrong.
Absolutely. Agreed. 100% agree.
I think that they're the easiest band in history to cover, because I think that there are so many. And maybe it's because they're just really good songs. And as we said earlier, sometimes if you revisit them, they don't sound as you imagined. And covering a song will be able to update the production values and maybe present a song that fits more with how you think the song originally sounded.
I think I'd largely agree, apart from, at one point, Yesterday was the most covered song of all time, I believe.
I think it still is.
There is not a single good cover of that song.
Oh, there are. Ray Charles's cover of Yesterday is better than the original, and so is Marvin Gaye's version. They are both better.
I don't like Marvin Gaye's version. I was listening to it
It's
earlier.
a lot more subtle, and it's more of a love song, but I think I'm just a sucker for Marvin Gaye's voice.
Yeah,
I was going into it expecting to like it, and it just changed it in a way that I didn't feel the same emotional.
Nearly every cover of Yesterday slows it down, and as soon as they do that, it makes it worse than the original. That's my problem with it. So I think if you compare like artists being covered, I'd say like Bob Dylan, for example, every time he's covered, that is nearly always better than the original.
He's another one.
Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily true of the Beatles. I think there are lots of very good covers, but I think there are a lot of covers that I don't prefer to the original. I was listening through the list of all the top Beatles covers, and there are 2 covers that get put at the top all the time. One of them, I agree, is probably better than the original. One of them is beautifully sung, but I don't think it's better than the original. And that's 2 covers of Across the Universe, which is Fiona Apple, which I do really like, and Rufus Wainwright, which I think is beautifully sung, but I don't think is better than the original.
Of course, David Bowie covered it on Young Americans in 1975 as well.
Yeah.
And I don't like the David Bowie version as much. It's like the one exception I have to what I previously said. David Bowie being in my top 3 artists of all time. And that's one of my favourite Bowie records, but I actually prefer the Beatles version. So maybe I'm not entirely right on that. It may be just me talking from my youth. Martyn, what was your favourite?
I was going to choose Dear Prudence, but that got stolen from me.
Yeah, sorry,
Susie and the Banshees. But I'm going to go with Strawberry Fields Forever by Candy Flip. There's the 90s. Yeah, it was fucking awesome.
It's awful.
Fucking awesome.
I've not heard this.
No, it's great.
It's like a Muzak interpretation with the funky drummer just thrown over the top like a tablecloth. The limp vocals that make me wonder if I'm having a coma. It's like I'm listening to a good song, but all the parts are played on instruments made of shit.
It's like going back to the 90s.
It's
very
so
90s.
It's so 90s.
What's wrong with that?
But it's
What is
just
wrong with that? What is wrong with that 90s fucking Manchester thing? It's
because
fucking wonderful.
Weed is a very different drug to ecstasy, and the psychedelic tinges of Strawberry Fields Forever by the Beatles are ruined by making it about dancing like a dickhead.
Yeah, but that's the point. That was the point of the song in the original place, and it was like it's about dancing in a field.
It's not about dancing. They didn't have the original doesn't have a dance beat, and it doesn't need it. It's about.
There's quite a good quote about the Beatles during the original from their press officer. He said, because obviously they've been on LSD, and he said it was a case of 4 Scousers exploring inner space and just finding more and more Scouser down there. And I think that quite nicely sums it up. It's that LSD trip, isn't it? All they found when they did LSD is more Scouser. It's great.
It's very Scouse. But anyway, I had my favourite taken away from me, and Dan, you took it.
But so the thing is, Martyn, I took your favourite off you, and you went for that over Hendrix.
Oh, was it you that took it from me?
Yeah.
Was it you?
Yes, it was
you
me.
Took the
it was me. I took that one because it's the best cover. And then you went for Candy Flip. You went for Candy Flip instead of Hendrix covering Day Tripper or Sgt. Pepper's.
Well, I'd forgotten about them.
Susie and the Banshees had a couple. Dear Prudence on 1984's Hyena album, but also their debut record features a cover of Helter Skelter as well from 1978. And that's really good. Susie and the Banshees are a great band, and they did some really good covers.
Susie and the Banshees are one of the greatest bands of all time, in my opinion. The whole post-punk fucking thing. And
they kind of they helped invent post-punk, didn't they, essentially?
Yeah.
They were there at the beginning.
Yes, they did, yeah. I'm going to let Tom speak about my favourite cover.
So it's mine as well. This one is definitely better than the original. It's one of the better Beatles songs ruined by Ringo's drumming, but this time the drumming's better. I see Dan's face. I discovered this song because this song is a post-punk song that is on Best of the 80s compilations. It's on some like weird Best of the 1980s compilation CD my parents had. Okay. And this song came on and I was like, I love this. I did happen to know it was by the Beatles before, but I instantly liked it better than the Beatles version. It's just cooler, basically. What more said?
Cooler is the best term. It really is. Like that guitar part is so perfect. Just it's way better than the original.
It adds an edge.
Yeah.
Dan, you had a really interesting one.
Yeah, and I'll be honest, it wasn't one I was familiar with before basically looking up a bunch of Beatles.
Yeah, I didn't.
So I picked Day Tripper, but by Jose Feliciano. Is that how you say it?
Yeah.
It's not that different, I don't think, to the original. I don't know. Let's just say there's a nice feel to it. It's very similar. I think one of the things that stands for it is that apparently John Lennon hated covers of their songs, but this was one that actually he approved of.
Oh, stamp of approval.
You've got the John Lennon seal of approval for this. And it's also, again, it's one of those covers that was at the time. It wasn't years and years later. So I think we're looking at a whole array of covers when trying to choose, all the way from that to Billie Eilish. This is really cool. It's just him and another guy with a big double bass just playing it. Sounds brilliant. I really would recommend people check it out.
If you're not familiar with Jose Feliciano, you'll know his most famous song gets played every year, and it's Feliz Navidad, his Christmas song. Yes. So he's a Brazilian...
Undeniable banger.
Yeah, Brazilian Latin folk jazz. He's got Joni Mitchell vibes to his music. It's good. I like Jose. But yeah, Feliz Navidad is the one that everybody knows, and they don't know it's him. My favourite Beatles cover is obvious for anyone who's been listening to the podcast for, well, any of the other episodes and know that I'm a raging Prince maniac. Because Prince in 2004 covered While My Guitar Gently Weeps for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame ceremony, which was actually a tribute to George Harrison himself after he died a few years earlier. Most people, I imagine, if you've ever used YouTube and have searched for a guitar solo on YouTube, it starts off as a straight cover with an all-star cast. It's got Danny Harrison, who is George Harrison's son. It's got Jeff Lynne, Tom Petty. It's also got Steve Winwood, who is playing on keyboards, who's another great artist in his own right, from Traffic, and Mark Mann, who was playing guitar largely in Jeff Lynne's backing band, and also helped to finish off George Harrison's posthumous 2002 release Brainwashed. And it seems fine. Everything's going according to plan. And then Prince steps up towards the end and is allowed to do his guitar solo. And he just makes While My Guitar Gently Weeps his own song. He takes that song from the Beatles and he makes it his own. He throws his guitar into the air. It never comes down. And Prince leaves the stage like some sort of alien presence. The Beatles song is great. I like the original. But this version takes it to another level and makes it one of the greatest guitar performances of all time. The solo is insanely good. He's showboating all the way through it. He throws himself back and gets caught by a security guard as he's stage diving whilst soloing. Danny Harrison loves it. He's got the coolest outfit on. It's the best Beatles cover.
I agree. That is literally the best guitar solo I've ever heard in my entire life. Like,
it's got to be up there.
As a guitar player, I can say if I could have done half of what he was doing in that solo, I would have made it. It's perfect in every way. Nice choice,
It is
Dan.
the best cover. You've won. This is easily the best cover. If I could have chosen it, I would have done.
Yeah, I wasn't letting you.
I know.
But Mark Mann, the guitarist who does the solos in the first half of it, is essentially just playing what was Eric Clapton on the studio version. And he's essentially just mimicking the same licks and riffs that Eric Clapton plays. And then the spotlight comes down on Prince and he just gets given about 3 minutes to absolutely wail. If you haven't seen it, check it out on YouTube. It's one of the greatest performances. Is Prince. I'm not going to pass up an opportunity to have Prince win something on this podcast. And for me, he wins.
We can't, because that'll be two things. He can't win because that'll be 2 in a row.
If you haven't seen our Cat News episode, go check it out because Prince is also the best Super Bowl halftime show of all time.
I know, and I can't let Prince win too.
There are also some other really good ones. I was imagining someone might call me out because it's a live cover. So if I was going to be pushed for a studio cover, I really love the Carpenters version of Ticket to Ride, but that's because Calvin Carpenter could sing the phone book and it would have sounded amazing.
Wilson Pickett's Hey Jude is also another one that you pointed out earlier. It's absolutely lovely.
Yeah.
It's better than the original.
Yeah. Hey Jude is a Marmite song. You either love it or hate it. I actually love it. I think it's great. But the Wilson Pickett song takes it to another level. It's this Southern soul behemoth, and it's got Duane Allman on guitar, on the slide guitar. It's absolutely amazing. Wilson Pickett, of course, being the guy who sang Land of a Thousand Dances and various other soul hits with a big, powerful voice. And he makes Hey Jude sound like the soul ballad it probably should have always been.
I also really quite like the Earth, Wind and Fire cover of Got to Get You Into My Life. That was pretty cool.
That is another one that's better than the original. And I can't remember, it might have been Paul McCartney, but they actually wrote that song to attempt to write a Motown R&B style hit. And then it was covered by Earth, Wind and Fire. And I think it was Paul McCartney said that's what the song should have always sounded like, because it gives it the funk energy it needed.
One cover I'm going to mention, because it was mentioned in our group chat by another member of the podcast who's not here tonight.
Jim.
And I've got to mention, Godhead's cover of Eleanor Rigby, because
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure I remember that being in the charts for ages. I don't actually like it at all.
I quite liked it. Industrial metal version of it. It is very 2001. Eleanor Rigby is such a magnificent song that there's not a lot you could do to it that would make it sound bad, in my opinion.
Oh, I think anything being done to it would ruin it. That's almost the way I would see it.
Well, it's not an idiosyncratic song for me, like a Purple Rain would be, where I don't think you can cover Purple Rain because everything about it is what Prince brings to the performance. Whereas I think the strength of Eleanor Rigby is in the songwriting. I think it's a well-constructed song. So I think it lends itself well to cover performances because the power of the song is in how it's arranged. Personally.
Then I think you'd have to play it as a very straight cover.
Yes. Yeah.
The vocal is a very straight cover.
Anybody listen to the Damned's version of Help? That was mental.
I haven't heard
It's
that.
like a very weird kind of punk sort of sounding version of Help. It's equally cool, but pretty terrible at the same time. But worth a listen. The only other one is one that you mentioned quite a bit earlier when you said about Joe Cocker's version of With a Little Help from My Friends. That
Yes.
was really good.
There's also I Wanna Hold Your Hand by Al Green. His soulful version of that is great. But I'm listening to myself here and I'm thinking, I may only just like these because I prefer the artists that cover them. So I don't know if they're necessarily better. I just prefer the voices of Wilson Pickett. I prefer the voice of Al Green. It's largely down to personal tastes. I think ultimately if you've got songs that are this strong, there's always going to be shitloads of good covers.
I don't know where this fits in the podcast at all, but shout out to Worms. Worms was the first place that I ever really knew the names of the four Beatles. Anybody that played the original Worms, PlayStation and probably PC as well. One of the teams, so you had four Worms in your team, and one of the teams were called the Fab Four, and you had George, Ringo, John and Paul.
I remember
and
that.
that was my very first introduction to those beings.
Well, I think that just speaks for how much of an impact they've had on pop culture. As I was saying earlier, pop culture almost starts in the mid-60s with the Beatles, as we know it now, with big album releases, heavily promoted singles, and recognisable band members that have an army of adoring fans. I think it all goes back to the Beatles. Whether or not you think that their albums are masterpieces or whether you think that they're a little bit messy, and whether you think that a particular song is great or not, I think that you can't deny that they are pivotal in the conversation to starting everything that we discuss on this podcast. So all of the conversations that we have about various forms of rock, pop, soul, the Beatles are the CT
The
extinction
genesis of
event.
it all.
Yeah, they created a meteor crater the size of Mexico, killed all the dinosaurs, and then created a new world that we all live in now, which has pop stars that we hate being thrown in our faces and all that kind of sinister side of fame. I think a lot of it stems from how people reacted to the Beatles. They put Britain on the map in America. No band has ever really captured the same success from here as the Beatles did in America.
There is one British band that broke America as well as the Beatles, probably.
And that's their contemporaries, Rolling Stones.
No, it's One Direction, isn't it?
Oh,
I hate to say it, but it's true. I don't want that to be the case.
they were massive.
Yeah, they were. There was the British invasion that the Beatles started into America, so bands looking to break America. So you had the Kinks did fairly well, the Rolling Stones did fairly well. None of them matched the Beatles, but they did well enough to make a living out of it.
I actually thought the other day, I'm going to go back and listen to a One Direction album. I think if I can go back and listen to the Beatles 1963, 1964 records, then compare them to what One Direction made in, say, 2011. That'll be an interesting comparison. But I have already ruined my street credibility by listening to Pipes of Peace, Tug of War, Ebony and Ivory, so many bad songs. I can't have One Direction also showing on my recently played for the moment. So we'll have to go there another time, I think.
That might be another episode. Listen along to One Direction.
We didn't get any undeniable bangers on this episode. Any?
No, we didn't.
I mean, we could have named like 5 Beatles songs as undeniable bangers, surely.
I would say Tomorrow Never Knows is an undeniable banger.
Agreed.
Yeah, all right.
Yeah. A Day in the Life.
I think Here
No.
Comes the Sun.
Here Comes the Sun
Here Comes
and
the Sun.
Come Together I'd do, but not A Day in the Life. It just doesn't... I don't think it's popular enough.
I would say Come Together, Here Comes the Sun, and Tomorrow Never Knows I'm happy to put in.
Yeah, I'd put those three.
Tomorrow
Eleanor
Never
Rigby.
Knows.
We in agreement?
Tomorrow Never Knows. Get that in there.
Cool.
Yeah, I'd agree on those.
Those are our thoughts on the Beatles, and whether you find them informative, you plainly disagree, or whether you were just listening along, not really paying any attention and like the bright colours. Let us know and hit us up on social media. Before we go though, we've got to decide what we are going to be covering on our next episode.
Quite like to listen to some new music, quote unquote.
We could do a chart one again.
So some sort of chart episode, I think, would be.
Should we
really
go back
useful.
into the top 10?
It probably hasn't changed in the last year, has it? It's probably the same tracks.
Well, we did the UK one in 2021, and then we did the US chart in 2022.
Should we do
So-
something stupid like the
It was
Japanese?
painful.
I'm not doing the Japanese chart. How are we going to fill 2 hours when none of us understood any of the lyrics or what has happened?
Who knows?
I think what we should do is it's been almost 2 years since we looked at the UK chart, so we can go back in. I'm sure it's changed since then.
I bet you one of the songs is still there.
We'll dip into the chart and see what's there. Hopefully there'll be some Drake for Al to get his teeth into. I don't know what this is going to be. We'll see you on the next episode of the Cacophony Sessions. Let us know your thoughts on the Beatles. In the meantime, stay funky. None of you are going to say anything.
No.
Just let me die on my arse as we fade out.
Beatles were good.
A pound shop Radiohead.